And so these events are no longer in living memory, but they're not that far removed from it. And so there's quite a bit of recent material we're going to be covering here. And we're going to be looking specifically at South Texas. That's the area that I focused on. Of course, the Mexican Revolution could be felt all along the US-Mexico boundary. It could also be felt in the Gulf of Mexico and other adjacent areas. And so we've got a bit to cover here. But I will be focusing primarily on South Texas. And since this always gets lost at the end, and time for questions, I'm going to say thank you now, instead of letting it fall apart. So first of all, the Office of Academic Affairs and Faculty Development Money, they provided some very generous support for my research over time in this area and in others. And so I want to be sure to thank them because I could have put together something competent without their support. I feel like I put together something really worthy with their support. And so they get a thank you there. Of course, the Columbus Library and the Historical Society for having me here today. By far, some of the most interesting materials I found were at the Museum of South Texas History. It's a beautiful site if you ever have the chance to visit it. The Center for Southwest Research at the University of New Mexico, of course, is a treasure within our own state. And of course, the New Mexico State Record Center and Archives as well. And then also Texas State Archives and the University of Texas Benson Collection. So this is just a selection of sources that I've looked at for this material. I'll start with a political cartoon, because I love to use these. And this one is called The Silent Vote, and I think it frames things very well. Because of course, living in New Mexico, when we think of the Mexican Revolution, we think of the Villa raid. I mean, it is ingrained in us. It is right here upon us. And I mean, it does get its due here. Here in the foreground, the headstone is in memory of US citizens murdered by Villa. And Villa was bloodthirsty enough that he's noted in a couple of other headstones here as well. But it also talks about victims of Mexican raids. It talks about victims of Mexican bandits and that sort of thing, and different outrages. So there was violence, there was insurgency all along the border. Columbus was, of course, one that endures because of how many died, but there was a considerable amount of turmoil in other areas. And I wanted to be sure I included this as well, because these are the service medals that were awarded to veterans of the various campaigns along the border who served in the US military. And in particular, I was quite pleased to see, if I remember correctly, Kathleen, that there's at least one of this particular medal in the collections behind the museum. So perhaps that'll be on display one day, and there was also a service cover as well. So you might see a few of those things making their way into the general collections. But so, I mean, these were formally recognized engagements by the US military. This wasn't just kind of like a quiet deployment where everybody went home. These were call-ups of tens of thousands of military personnel lasting over a period of several years. A little bit of background on the Mexican Revolution. The most important thing to remember is that, I suspect you all know this already, US policy is ridiculously contradictory. It's not just a function of who's in office. It's not just a function of which political party holds power. And it's all the more surprising because the same names keep showing up as advisors.
Oh boy.
And even though that happens, and across both parties, even though that happens, we don't have cohesive foreign policies. And we didn't then either. And that's part of the reason that the border was so in turmoil. You would think it's just because those Mexicans were killing each other and it was spilling over, but no, the United States played a decided role in making things worse. Another major thing that contributed to that is that US influence in the Mexican Revolution, the most significant influence we exerted was in deciding who could buy weapons and who could buy supplies. And sites all along the border were set up to cater to sell bullets, to sell rifles, to sell food, to sell train passes, to provide hotels where people could plan campaigns over room service. There was, honest to God, a moment where Villa was offered the opportunity to buy a submarine, if you can imagine that. And I think I'm trying to make sure that the photo I found was authentic, but I think I finally found a photo of Villa standing on top of the conning tower of a submarine, because there was a moment where his army was that flush with cash that he was able to do that. And the arms contractor, they had a submarine they needed to sell. The Tsar of Russia was going to buy it, but they weren't doing so well. And a submarine isn't I guess it's something that depreciates really fast when it's sitting on the line. So that's another thing that we did. But on top of it, the US had the idea of playing kingmaker. And we did this at different points. There were several interventions early on, but we're going to look at the two key factions that had emerged by 1914. And those, of course, were the Villa Zapata faction and the Carranza Obregón factions. And this was already after a lot of fighting, but these are the folks we're going to focus on for today. If you've never seen him before, this is Venustiano Carranza. This is an image, I don't know where it originally came from. This particular one I pulled from the Library of Congress. I doubt it's there. I doubt they have original ownership of it. And of course, here's Villa. And I choose this picture because, boy, everybody's all smiles in that photo, right? I'm not sure if they were all smiles 2 years later when they were all trying to kill each other, but the US also has a very bad habit of cultivating allies for specific purposes that later on are not perhaps as friendly as they were. And it's not just this picture alone. By the way, I'm sure you all know, this is Pershing on the far left, this is Villa in the center, this is Obregón on the right. Again, all of these folks are trying to kill each other by 1916. This isn't something that ended with the Mexican Revolution. If Donald Rumsfeld could have gotten rid of the photo of him shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in 1983, I'm sure he would have. It probably wasn't something he was proud of. If all of the people who supported and gave money to the Mujahideen in the 1970s and 80s because they were killing Soviets could have taken their money back after 2001 and they destroyed the Twin Towers, they probably would have thought about that again. These are ongoing problems, and God only knows the folks that we work with over the last 2 decades when they're going to be showing up again. But this is a time-honored problem in US policy. We have a very short sight on who we're working with for immediate goals, and then later on it comes back to cause some problems. Now Wilson, of course, said all the right things in public. He said whoever Mexico picks for its leader and how their government takes shapes, well, that's a Mexican issue. Behind the grounds, though, of course, both Villa's faction and Carranza's faction were still receiving weapons. And the administration was constantly debating, as the Taft administration had before it, and the Harding administration would after it, who should have access to arms sales. There were some key battles in 1914, 1915, especially Celaya and León, where Obregón won a series of major victories. And if the generals of Europe had been there to study those victories, they might have saved some lives on the battlefields of Europe. Machine guns, trenches, barbed wire, all of those goodies. These were key tactics and that were used during those fights. But Obregón scored some major victories and Villa was on the ropes. Villa's on the ropes, and Wilson himself is hoping that Villa will concede defeat. And Villa obviously had not read anything about Villa. Villa was never going to be the type of person who would admit he was beaten, by any means. And on top of it, in cabinet discussions, cabinet officials are still saying, well, maybe we should buy some beef from Villa. Maybe that'll, give him a chance to rebuild his army. And when you have two armies fighting, discussing how you're going to rebuild one that you're not necessarily sure you support, this is how chaotic the administration's policy was. And so it's in that context that Carranza decided to take a little initiative on his own. And he said, my side has the advantage here. We're going to push it, and we're going to force recognition from the United States. And for as much as there is a tendency still to today to think of political leaders, voters, and people in Latin America as being comparatively unsophisticated compared to us, the US looked like fools by the time this was all done. The level of political sophistication that Carranza showed was a masterpiece. Honestly, the only thing really keeping Mexico today from taking credit for this is the fact that some of these documents are still classified in their archives. It saves us a little bit of pride, but I guess it keeps the peace. So this comes to the plan of San Diego. And the plan was not named for San Diego, California. It was named for a little town called San Diego, Texas, in South Texas. And this plan wasn't unique, first of all. It was a plan that called for the retaking of territory that Mexico had lost previously. And there had been plans circulating to do this since the Treaty of Guadalupe had been signed. There were at least 3 pre-existing plans during the Mexican Revolution talking about how to organize and retake land. That in itself wasn't significant. The two things that were significant, though, were first of all the timing. This plan was published within a few months of Carranza looking for a means to pressure the US, number one. And number two, this plan was the blueprint for a race war, and that ended up terrifying Americans. Because it didn't just call for the restoration of territory. The plan also called for insurgents to execute any American male over the age of 16. So you read that, and that's going to get your attention. It called for the creation of states out of the newly acquired territories. And in fact, they specifically wanted to create a new state for Apaches, and they specifically wanted to create a new state for African Americans. And they were going to do those in Oklahoma, and, well, it went back and forth, but Mississippi was the primary one for African Americans. Initially, even so, the plan wasn't taken seriously. A Mexican operative named Basilio Ramos was captured. He was incarcerated on the border. American officials found a copy of the plan on him. They read it. They released him from jail, and they remanded him for mental health evaluation, because you read this and you don't take it too seriously. It became very serious in short order, though, because what it offered was a scheme for Carranza. There was a blueprint for an insurgency. It didn't have funding, it didn't have weapons, it didn't have command and control, and it didn't have organization, but Carranza had all of those. And what he wanted to do then was to take this blueprint of insurgency and then unleash these raids across South Texas. And if he did that, he would then ratchet up pressure on the United States. He would say, oh, there are these independent generals, I'd like to be able to control this, but I'm one of two people trying to be president right now. Maybe if you recognized me as president, I would have the ability to bring order back to the border. But he used this as an opportunity to encourage bandit raiders. They initially began with what we think of as an outright traditional guerrilla campaign. They destroyed telegraph lines, they blew up train tracks, they derailed trains, all those sorts of things that you would think along those lines. And these began in the summer of 1915. Now, the plan had the template and the tone of a race war, but it was also a means of settling scores. Because the sediciosos, the seditionists, who were carrying out this insurgency, actually used it as a means to settle two types of scores. First of all, some of them had been small landowners in South Texas, and they had been pressured by white immigrants to sell their land on very unfavorable terms. This was a chance to even that score and to terrorize those folks. But second of all, there were those Hispanics in Texas who served in law enforcement, who had businesses, who had otherwise become fundamental members of society in South Texas. It was also a chance to even the score with them and to terrorize them. So even though the plan ostensibly calls to start executing white men left and right, there was an Hispanic sheriff killed almost immediately. There were Hispanic families that were terrorized in different ranches and that sort of thing. And so this was the initial wave of violence in the summer of 1915. What then happens over the next 2 years is that this metastasizes, and the cost essentially comes to be paid by Hispanics all over South Texas. Because the US military itself was very discriminating in deciding when and how to use force. Organizations like the Texas Rangers were not. They were happy to kill anybody they could get their hands on. And law enforcement in Texas varied. Some tried to protect prisoners until they got fair trials, and some gave them over to the Rangers to be lynched. And so this was the story of Texas in 1915 and 1916. A couple of more folks to introduce here. Frederick Funston, who you may or may not have heard of. Funston was actually one of the last of the notable American generals who actually came up through ROTC. Born in Kansas, he had applied for West Point. His health wasn't good and he didn't get in. He didn't really have good prospects, but he still got his foot in the door with a commission. He actually served with distinction in after the Spanish-American War. He was deployed to the Philippines. And if you've heard of Emiliano Aguinaldo, the architect of the US insurgency against the US in the Philippines, Funston came up with the strategy to capture Aguinaldo using deception. And he became a household name at that point. So this was a person who had some serious experience in anti-insurgency, first of all. If you ever actually want to read something negative about him, Mark Twain despised Funston because Funston was also in command of the Presidio in 1905 when the earthquake and fire hit San Francisco. And Twain did not care for the martial law and the measures, the crisis measures that Funston implemented, and the people that were shot for looting and that kind of thing. So it's very easy to find a copy of Twain's critique of Funston if you want to read somebody who didn't think very highly of him. In 1914, Funston was also appointed by Wilson as the military governor of Veracruz when the United States occupied Veracruz briefly in a different, earlier intervention against a different person who I didn't have time to get into, but he also had experience in Mexico. And so finally, he was entrusted with U.S. Southern Command. And so he was in command of all forces in the region that would essentially be operating anywhere in Latin America, but during this time period, what we really mean is operating along the Mexican border. He actually would have been the commander of the U.S. American Expeditionary Force into Europe in 1917. But if you've ever been to the St. Anthony Hotel in San Antonio, he actually died of a massive heart attack in the lobby in February 1917. And there's this terrifying moment where MacArthur actually was the one who delivered the news to President Wilson, and the entire cabinet was stunned. They said, who are we going to put in charge of the forces that are going to Europe? And of course we know ultimately that they settled on Pershing, but it wasn't a certainty at that point. Funston had been such a clear contender and died very suddenly and very tragically. And then my own personal villain in the story, James E. Ferguson, governor of Texas during this period as well. A man who ultimately, like Al Capone, suffered not for all the evil he had done, but for other reasons. He was responsible for blessing quite a bit of the violence against Hispanics in South Texas. He was ultimately impeached by the Texas legislature and banned from running for office by end of the decade. But he was impeached for bribery and for interfering with how the University of Texas was being run. He wasn't impeached for all the other things he had done. And on top of it, his wife ran for governor and became the first governor of Texas and effectively governed on his behalf. So it's not like this man suffered terribly for the things I'll be telling you all about. So Funston is in charge of U.S. Southern Command, moves thousands of troops to South Texas. The violence increases. Ferguson wants the border brought under control. We see this now, we see this then. Ferguson wasn't even the first governor to be screaming. That his predecessor, Colquitt, had screamed that the U.S. didn't know what it was doing along the border, they needed to restore order, all of these things. Colquitt was actually a very reasonable person who took measured action to the benefit of all Texans. Ferguson called the captain of the Texas Rangers into his office and says, I want order restored. I will grant you pardons for anything that you have to do that. So, I mean, we've seen the pardon power played out in different ways throughout our entire lives and before. It's quite another thing to grant a pardon before somebody does anything, effectively telling them that they can do what they want and you'll sort it out later. Funston, as I said, showed remarkable restraint. He was able to create a military organization that had the discipline to not fire unless fired upon, because the U.S. could not afford to be drawn into a war at this point. The U.S. might choose to go to war, and that was different, but it wasn't going to be by accident. But Funston and Wilson were hoping to avoid a war because everybody knew what was going on in Europe. And the writing was on the wall that the U.S. was likely going to be heading over there, and we most certainly did not want to instead be fighting in Mexico. So Funston did everything he could to adhere to posse comitatus. He did everything to distinguish between citizens and raiders. He did everything he could to take the most measured response he could to the violence. The Rangers did not. This was the low point for the Texas Rangers. Any opportunity they had to execute, to lynch, etc., they took. And there are, I'll get to why in a moment, how we know this. But the unfortunate thing aside from that is that there are several notable battles against bandits where the Rangers were not present. They were elsewhere, but they showed up the next day for photos. Okay. And so I apologize for this photo because it is a bit graphic. Look down if you don't want to. Oh, did I get rid of it? Oh, there we go. So these are Texas Rangers proudly posing. These are bandits that were killed outside of the Norius Ranch in South Texas. This is a branch of the King Ranch that everybody's heard of. The Rangers were nowhere nearby. The bandits were repelled by a detachment of soldiers. They were repelled by some farm workers, a couple of U.S. Customs officials, and that kind of thing. But the Rangers were glory hounds, and they wanted to look tough. This was a great publicity photo for them. So they've lassoed bandits, and they're dragging them to town to put on display. In terms of deaths, I still can't give you a number, and we're more than a century after the fact. From the summer of 1915 to the summer of 1916, we know there were about 21 US military deaths and civilian deaths in South Texas. Got a pretty good handle on that one. What we don't know is how many Hispanics, how many Mexicans or Mexican Americans were killed. Funston thought about 300 had been killed. In 1919, the Texas legislature held a series of hearings. There are 3 volumes and about 1,000 pages if you'd like to read them. I do recommend it. It's fascinating material. But the legislature itself placed the figure as high as several thousand. And they weren't counting the thousands who fled back across the border into Mexico to get away from the violence. It's not an issue with the fog of war, it's a matter of intent. Because Ferguson did authorize whatever action was necessary. He authorized the legal cover to do it, and some of his subsequent actions even made matters worse. So you've seen that photo now. And just to say that this was a major guerrilla campaign, this is a train at Olmitos outside of Brownsville. And insurgents had blown up the tracks, they had derailed the train. This is the next day, the train is derailed there. I mean, this was a major attack. For as much as there was a reign of terror in South Texas, let's temper that a little bit and understand that there is a family here posing in the foreground for this picture. This was their souvenir, and this was not the only family out posing that day. There were plenty of families that were showing up to take their photo with the derailed train. So it was also somewhat of a public event that everybody wanted to be a part of, even if they didn't think even if they didn't support insurgents. Carranza was successful in 1915. He convinced Wilson that if he had the authority, that he could continue to punish ineffective generals, he could bring the violence to a stop. Wilson extends de facto recognition to Carranza's government. What this means immediately in late 1915 is that the arms spigot to Villa stops. It's no longer legal for Villistas to cross the border and buy weapons and supplies. And so the major chance that they had to get back on their feet and be a viable force in the revolution is coming to an end very quickly. But the other thing is that Carranza wants to take a more active approach to defeating Villa. So what he negotiates is that the bulk of his forces are located in Eagle Pass, Texas. And there's not a direct rail line in northern Mexico from that part of Texas to Arizona. But there is a direct line from Eagle Pass to Arizona on the US side. So Carranza's forces are allowed to cross the border, hop on US trains, and be transported to Arizona, to cross the border again, and then to face Villa's remaining major army in battle. And they clobber the remaining Villista army. After this campaign, Villa was eliminated as a military force in Mexico decisively. He was reduced to the role of bandit, and I don't want to minimize what bandit means because the Columbus raid was banditry. Bandits still kill and still take decisive actions. But of course, Villa was the exact wrong person to treat this way. Villa not only wanted revenge against Carranza, he wanted revenge against the United States. And that, of course, is what takes us to Columbus. And this is probably one of many photos you've all seen. This is in the aftermath of the Columbus raid. The other major event, of course, immediately after the Columbus raid is that the Pershing expedition crosses into Mexico and, interestingly enough, is surprised because they not only have to fight Villistas, they have to fight Carranza's army as well. Carranza doesn't want them there any more than Villa does. And in fact, even though I haven't seen any documents to this effect, there was certainly a handshake agreement where Villistas and Constitutionalists stopped shooting each other for a little bit to shoot at the Pershing expedition. They can agree on that much. Now, simultaneously, Carranza wants to exert even more pressure on the U.S. to force the U.S. Army out, because this is a major blow to Mexico's national pride, to have U.S. forces on their soil. Fortunately, Carranza still has those insurgents in South Texas, and he ramps them back up again in the summer of 1916. He starts to supply them with weapons again, starts to provide command and control, provide leadership, and that sort of thing, with the key difference being this time that we have much more abundant evidence that the core of the insurgent groups was formed around actual members of the Mexican military. In trials that took place afterwards, there were Mexican soldiers who were on trial and ultimately who were exonerated because they were acting under legitimate orders in a military structure. So they were treated as insurgents might be in the course of the war. And of course, there are many clashes. The other major difference being that the raids in South Texas are no longer staged against ranches. They're not blowing up telegraph lines anymore, that kind of thing. They're raiding U.S. Army detachments actively themselves instead. The Pershing itself, a major defeat at Cadi Sal. American soldiers killed, 11 killed, 24 taken prisoner. And the U.S. and Mexico are once again at the brink of war. A war that either one of them could have been pushed into very easily. What happens here ultimately, though, is Wilson knows that he can't afford to go to war with Mexico because we're now a year closer, with it being even more obvious that the U.S. is heading for World War I. In fact, it's very clear from documents from the Wilson administration that other historians have looked at that Wilson used the Pershing expedition primarily to train the military in preparation for deployment. Otherwise, you don't get the guy who lost at Cadi Sal and couldn't find Villa and reward him with a command. He satisfied his actual objectives, not the stated one of finding Villa. Now, what ultimately happens here between the two countries is that Carranza is now able to get formal, legal, official recognition out of the Wilson administration. And Carranza formally retires all of the insurgents fighting in the Plan de San Diego. And there is actually some good evidence. We see some of them later actually writing to the central government 5 and 6 years later asking for pensions for their service to the Mexican government in the course of this insurgency. Now, that violence comes to an end, but the violence instigated by the Rangers in South Texas reaches a new height. And this is where we see the largest toll of casualties against civilians, and where we start to see hundreds and later thousands of Hispanics fleeing back across the border into Mexico. And so they were the ones who took the brunt. The moment where this hit its peak came in the summer of 1916, and the term loyalty ranger should have been expelled from everybody's vocabulary. It actually came up again on the floor of the Texas legislature last year, and that person should have had their mouth washed out with soap. But it takes us back to the idea of the Rangers as the agency that are enforcing loyalty. And so the piece that I contributed in my research, not the only thing, but the thing that I'm proudest of, Ferguson made a proclamation demanding that all Hispanics in South Texas make an active demonstration of loyalty, or, in his words, bring trouble upon themselves, and many crimes will be committed which cannot be prevented. The cruel irony being that these folks had been suffering already for a year. They knew what the cruel crimes were. But Ferguson publishes this proclamation demanding an active show of loyalty by Hispanics all through South Texas, or the Rangers are going to drop the hammer on them. I mentioned that he had been impeached. This document actually no longer exists in Texas records. I was actually in the state archives, and there's a nice 3-day hole between the proclamation that's released 3 days before this one and a couple of days after. When Ferguson was burning records, this was apparently one that he thought needed to go. It's an interesting combination in historical methodology, because what I did find in the records in the state Texas archives are records of prominent Hispanics in South Texas who are writing to Ferguson saying, I'm publishing your proclamation. The implied is, please don't kill me, but I'm publishing your proclamation, I'm loyal. Okay, I'm distributing 500 copies of this, I'm distributing 1,000 copies of this, I'm running it in this newspaper and that kind of thing. So my eyes really shot up when I saw those little Ferguson, and I was wondering what they were talking about. And then finally, I was, because, it's kind of a loss, I guess, but all of these sorts of things used to be published in national newspapers by Reuters and other groups. That's how I was actually able to find it. This had been published in, I can't remember which small newspaper I found, but despite Ferguson's best efforts, the document survived. So that was an interesting thing to come across. Legacies. You all know the World War I legacies. The US military was better prepared for World War I than it would have been otherwise. Perhaps a few more interesting things. Quite a few of us know about Patton's use of mechanized forces in chasing some of the Villistas. Omar Bradley, actually, the father of mechanized warfare, Omar Bradley was also a young officer at the time. He was stationed near Bisbee. So he was not actively involved in any of the campaign, but he had a lot of time on his hands. And this is where Omar Bradley started to form his theories on using trucks to move infantry around. And that was a decisive contribution to World War II, the idea of creating mechanized infantry. So this is another idea that was born out of the Mexican intervention. The immediate legacies, the US had a draft to bring people into the military in World War I. You can imagine that a lot of Hispanics in South Texas weren't real stoked to sign up. That was a problem because in 1917, 1/5 of the US military was foreign born, and 1/4 of them didn't speak English as their first language. So when we say that you have a significant population in South Texas not signing up, that's a major impediment for military effectiveness on the eve of war. And then there are all of these other events that you may have heard of, the Bath riots, the Port Venir massacre. I mentioned loyalty rangers. The rangers weren't just there to evaluate the loyalty of citizens individually, but ultimately the rangers got stationed in voting booths in South Texas and were actually there as an armed presence to deter Hispanics from showing up to vote. There were hearings in 1919. There was a prominent state representative named J.T. Canales. He forced hearings on the Texas legislature focusing on ranger violence. That's the 3-volume, 1,000 pages I mentioned earlier. Canales was threatened on the steps of the State House by one of the rangers for doing this. The hearings conclude that that the rangers had run amok, but there weren't really any long-term punishments. And in fact, the longer-term issue was that after Canales was threatened, after we see the effectiveness of the loyalty rangers, there's no Hispanic elected to statewide office in Texas until the 1950s. This is an incredible act of suppression. That we judge its effectiveness by what happened, even when we can't see the methods all the way through. One last thing, the Rangers were suppressed for some time, but it's okay, they found jobs because the Border Patrol was created a few years later. And there were quite a few unemployed Rangers that had proven themselves in South Texas, and they were some of the formative agents in the Border Patrol itself. This is something that interests me. I told you that part of the thing that Mexican officials brought was command and control. In South Texas, I actually got a copy of the cipher that they used. It's a series of 4 concentric circles. Each letter of the alphabet can be represented by 3 or 4 numbers. And so you have this telegram of numbers. And if you have the cipher disk and you have the key, you can figure out what this says. I got the cipher disk and I got the telegram, I don't got the key. But I have started tinkering with it. And so I actually have a rudimentary program in Python where if I set values for one letter, like let's say A could be 5, or A could be 27, or A could be 70, or whatever you set it for, then you could actually create a telegram using this system to assign orders. And so that was kind of cool. I thought that was interesting. What I'd really like to do is to be able to set it so that anybody could come and set the initial sequence. It's a bit harder programming to do. And the thing that I would really, really, really like to do after that is to actually be able to brute force this. All I can do right now is take a sequence and translate it into numerical code, or take a given numerical and translate it back. What I can't do is take this where I don't have a key and find out what this person actually said. And there was a very good couple, the DeWitts, were actually regarded as the creators of American cryptography. And a bunch of their papers are sitting in archives in Kansas. They did all of the frequency analysis to actually decipher this stuff and had a reasonably good record. I'd love to be able to take a crack at that sometime and see if there's a way to go back and decode some of these that they might not have had. Last thing I'll say, we all love to read. This will be on the website because I'll be giving my slides as well. This is the beginnings of a bibliography. Have fun. I'm happy to answer your questions, but there's plenty more for you all to go read. So, thank you.
Thank you.